My name is Alex, and I always thought my childhood memories were buried for a reason. I just never expected them to start building themselves into the walls of my own home. The drywall didn't just crack, it exhaled. I stood in my hallway at 3:17 a.m., the floorboards cold against my heels, staring at a door that hadn't existed when I brushed my teeth 2 hours ago. It was a heavy, slab-style wooden door, painted a shade of institutional white that seemed to suck the dim amber light out of the hallway. There was no trim, no molding, just a raw, surgical slit in the floral wallpaper where the frame had forced its way through. I reached out, my fingers trembling so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. The brass doorknob wasn't just cold, it was freezing, coated in a thin, microscopic layer of frost that bit into my palm like a handful of needles. As I turned it, the mechanism didn't click, it grumbled, a wet, metallic sound like teeth grinding against bone. A smell began to seep through the gap as the door swung inward, a cloying, suffocating mixture of old cedar, mothballs, and the copper tang of a fresh nosebleed. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, a trapped animal desperate to escape the cage of my chest. I should have turned around. I should have ran out the front door and never looked back. But the silence of the house felt heavy, pushing me toward the threshold with a physical weight. I stepped over the frame, my bare foot landing on plush, high-pile carpet that felt unnervingly warm, almost like stepping onto something living. The transition was instantaneous and sickening. I wasn't in my hallway anymore. I was standing in a rectangular tomb of childhood nostalgia that made my stomach do a slow, oily flip. This was my bedroom from 1994, reconstructed with a terrifying anatomical precision. The glow didn't come from a lamp. It emanated from a string of plastic glow-in-the-dark stars tacked to the ceiling, but they weren't glowing green. They were pulsing a bruised, necrotic purple. On the small twin bed, the blue comforter was rumpled, as if someone had just scrambled out of it in a panic. I walked toward the center of the room, my breath hitching, as I noticed the details that were slightly, cosmically wrong. The stuffed bear on the rocking chair didn't have glass eyes. It had wet, blinking human eyelids that twitched as I passed. The air here was thick, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that felt like a migraine taking root in my skull. I turned toward the closet. The sliding door cracked open just an inch. From the darkness within, I heard a sound that froze the marrow in my bones. The rhythmic, wet dragging of something heavy across the floorboards, accompanied by a faint, whistling wheeze. It sounded like a pair of punctured lungs trying to find a rhythm. Just as I reached out to grab the edge of the door to retreat, a small, pale hand, grayish and translucent, with visible, blackened veins, pressed firmly against the inside of the closet door, slowly sliding it shut. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It wasn't just a room. It was a memory that had been flayed open and left to rot. And as I backed away, my heel hit something soft and damp on the floor that let out a faint, muffled whimper. I didn't look down. I just bolted back into the hallway and slammed the white door shut. But the copper smell lingered on my skin, thick and impossible to wash off. The copper stench didn't wash off. I scrubbed my hands until the skin was raw and weeping, but the smell of old blood and mothballs seemed to have moved inside my pores, a permanent resident of my anatomy. By Wednesday morning, the white door hadn't just returned. It had matured. The frame looked jagged now, the wood splintered as if it had clawed its way through the drywall from the other side, leaving trails of gray dust like powdered bone on my hallway floor. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked haggard, my eyes bloodshot and sunken, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the knob, which felt fever hot this time, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. When I pushed it open, the bedroom was bathed in a thick, gelatinous red light that seemed to filter through the very walls. The air was soup-thick, tasting of wet iron and ozone. I stepped inside, and the door behind me didn't just close, it sealed with a wet, organic squelch, like a healing wound. That's when the sound started. It wasn't just whispering, it was a rhythmic, collective wheezing that pulsed in time with the glowing stars on the ceiling. The walls weren't static anymore. Underneath the peeling, animal-patterned wallpaper, something was moving. I watched in paralyzed horror as the paper bubbled and stretched, revealing the distinct, sharp outlines of human faces pressing outward from within the lath and plaster. They weren't screaming. They were reciting my middle name over and over in a dry, papery hiss that sounded like dead leaves trapped in a chimney. I backed away, my heels sinking into the carpet, which now felt uncomfortably slick, saturated with a dark, viscous fluid that bubbled up around my toes. Every time I breathed, the walls seemed to lean in closer, the faces beneath the paper contorting into expressions of silent, agonized pleading. The center of the room held a new, horrific centerpiece that wasn't there yesterday. My old Fisher-Price record player sat on the floor, its plastic arm scraping across a disc made of what looked like translucent, sun-dried skin. As it spun, it didn't play music. It emitted the sound of a child sobbing, interrupted by the wet, rhythmic slapping of something heavy hitting a basement floor. I tried to move toward the exit, but the whispering shifted into a high-pitched, harmonic shriek that vibrated the marrow in my shins. One of the faces in the wall, a small, distorted visage near the light switch, actually tore through the wallpaper. It wasn't a ghost. It was a physical, grayish tongue, long and coated in black bile, lashing out to taste the air before retreating into the drywall with a satisfied slurping sound. The room was claiming me, digesting my history in real time. I noticed the closet door from the night before was now wide open, revealing a void so absolute it felt like a physical weight pulling at my vision. Hanging from the top of the closet frame was a single, braided cord of human hair, swaying in a draft that shouldn't have existed. At the end of the cord swung a small silver tooth, still wet at the root, catching the necrotic red light. The whispering grew deafening, 1,000 voices now screaming for me to look under, their collective breath blowing the hair cord toward me like a beckoning finger. I felt a cold, phantom hand brush against the back of my neck, the fingers ending in sharp, broken nails that dragged slowly down my spine, leaving lines of fire in their wake. I lunged for the door handle, screaming as the wood felt soft and fleshy under my grip, and threw myself back into the hallway. I collapsed onto my floral rug, my lungs burning, only to find a single, jagged scrap of the animal wallpaper clutched in my fist, and on the back of it, written in fresh, glistening ink, was the exact time I was going to die. The ink on that scrap of wallpaper didn't dry. It thickened into a crusty black scab that pulsed against my palm like a dying heart. 4:44 a.m. That was the timestamp for my expiration, scrawled in a handwriting that looked exactly like my own, only more frantic, as if my hands had been shaking with a palsy of pure terror. Thursday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised lung, and the doorway had transformed again. The institutional white paint was peeling back in long, wet strips that looked like sunburnt skin, revealing a frame made of dark, porous bone that hissed as it oxidized in the hallway air. I didn't want to go in, but the hallway behind me was beginning to dissolve, the floral wallpaper curling into blackened ash as the house itself seemed to reject my presence. I stepped through the bone frame, and the floor didn't just creak, it let out a low, wet groan, the sound of a heavy weight settling onto a bed of dry autumn leaves. The childhood bedroom was now a theater of silent, surgical gore. The blue comforter on the bed had been shredded into thousands of thin silk ribbons, and they were all suspended in midair, undulating as if caught in an underwater current. In the center of the room, my old wooden desk was no longer made of oak. It had been replaced by a slab of gray, fatty marble that sweated a clear, salty fluid. Lying on the center of that slab was a single sheet of construction paper, the bright yellow of a dead sunflower, and the drawing on it was so vivid it felt like it was burning a hole in the reality of the room. It depicted me, Alex, standing in this very room, but my stomach had been unzipped, and a swarm of tiny pale gray hands were reaching out from my own torso to grab the edges of the paper. The drawing wasn't static. As I leaned closer, the crayon lines began to bleed and shift, the waxy red of the internal organs dripping off the page and onto the marble slab with a rhythmic splat, splat, splat that echoed in the oppressive silence. The "He sees you" text at the bottom wasn't written in crayon. It was etched into the paper with what looked like a jagged fingernail, the grooves deep and raw. I reached out to touch the paper, and the moment my skin made contact, a searing jolt of electricity shot up my arm, followed by a cold, numbing sensation that turned my fingertips a ghostly shade of blue. The air in the room suddenly dropped 40 degrees, and my breath came out in thick, gray plumes that hung in the air like ghosts. From beneath the desk, a small mechanical toy, a tin drummer I hadn't seen since I was 5, began to march toward me, its metal feet clattering with a frantic metallic urgency. But it wasn't playing a drum. It was beating its tiny metal sticks against a pile of human finger bones, the hollow clack, 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 synchronized with the pulsing stars on the ceiling. I looked up, and the stars were no longer plastic. They were actual, wet human eyes, pinned to the ceiling with rusted thumbtacks, all of them blinking in unison as they tracked my every move. The closet door, which had been a void of darkness, now began to leak a thick, black bile that smelled of a 1,000-year-old grave. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure on my ankles, and I looked down to see the carpet fibers weaving themselves together into thick, hairy ropes that were tightening around my shins, pulling me toward the desk. I grabbed the drawing, the paper feeling hot and oily in my grip, and hacked at the carpet ropes with the edge of the marble slab. I scrambled back through the bone door, the sound of 1,000 tiny mechanical drums chasing me into the hallway, where the clock on the wall was now spinning backward at an impossible speed, ticking toward 4:44. The clock didn't just tick, it stuttered, the second hand vibrating against the glass like a trapped hornet. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and the hallway doorway had shed its bone frame for something far more repulsive, a threshold of wet, pulsating muscle that rippled whenever I drew a breath. The floral wallpaper around it was sloughing off in gray, ashen flakes, revealing a substrate of charred lath that smelled of a house fire that hadn't happened yet. I stepped through, my boots sinking into a floor that had turned from carpet into a layer of loose, damp topsoil. The childhood bedroom was gone, replaced by a cavernous, subterranean version of itself, where the walls were lined with thousands of small glass jars. Inside each jar, a different piece of my past: a milk tooth, a lock of hair, a fingernail clipping, was suspended in a thick amber fluid that glowed with a sickly bioluminescent light. In the center of the room, my old Fisher-Price activity center had been gutted and rebuilt into a pedestal of rusted rebar and surgical wire. Resting on top was the diary, but it wasn't leather. The cover was a patchwork of human skin, different tones stitched together with black silk thread, and the edges were still rimmed with a fine, crusty salt. When I touched it, the skin of the book was warm, unnervingly so, and I could feel a faint, rhythmic thrumming beneath the surface, like a dormant heart trying to find its beat. I opened the first page, and the ink didn't sit on the paper. It burrowed into the fibers, the letters squirming like tiny black parasites as they formed sentences that I felt in my gut before I read them with my eyes. "He didn't leave because he was bored," the entry from October 22nd whispered in a voice that bypassed my ears and echoed in my marrow. "He left because your blood finally tasted like the harvest." The air in the room suddenly curdled, becoming so thick with the scent of wet iron and scorched hair that I had to gag into my sleeve. I flipped through the pages, the skin binding stretching and groaning with a sound like a wet leather boot being pulled from deep mud. The entries weren't just words. They were sensory triggers that forced my brain to relive moments I'd spent decades burying. I saw my 6-year-old self huddled in the closet, not hiding from a monster, but watching my own shadow detach itself from the floor and begin to eat the toys scattered on the rug. The last entry, dated today, was written in a dark, viscous fluid that refused to dry, the letters glistening like fresh obsidian. "The door is a mouth, Alex. You've been walking into its throat every morning, and now the teeth are ready to close." As I read the last word, the jars on the walls began to shatter in a synchronized explosion of glass and amber fluid. The floor beneath my feet heaved, the soil parting to reveal a network of thick, gray veins that pulsed with a frantic industrial rhythm. From the shadows of the open closet, a long, multi-jointed limb, covered in a fine, colorless fur and ending in a cluster of human-looking eyes, slid out across the dirt, its many pupils dilating as they locked onto me. The whispering from the walls didn't just return, it intensified into a physical vibration that cracked the plaster, the voices now screaming in a harmonious guttural tone that my name was a debt that had finally come due. I clutched the skin-bound diary to my chest, the warmth of the book now a searing, blistering heat that began to fuse the leather to my palms. I scrambled toward the fleshy exit, but the muscle of the doorframe was contracting, the opening shrinking into a tight, airless slit that smelled of gastric acid and ancient, unwashed secrets. The clock didn't strike 4:44 a.m. It simply arrived with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my chest. I stood in the hallway, my fingers buried deep into the jagged tiers of the floral wallpaper. There was no white paint left, only the raw gray drywall I had shredded in the dark. I didn't need to turn a knob this time. I simply leaned forward, and the wall seemed to give way, not like a door, but like a memory finally surrendering. I stepped into the room, and for the first time, the smell of copper and mothballs was gone. It was replaced by the scent of my own sweat and the stale air of a house that hadn't seen a guest in months. The glowing stars on the ceiling were dim, flickering out one by one as if they were tired of watching. I walked toward the mirror, my bare feet clicking against the floorboards. The carpet was gone, leaving only the bare, cold wood of reality. I looked into the glass. I didn't see a shadowy entity or a red-eyed monster. I saw a man with hollowed-out eyes and skin the color of newsprint. My hands were stained dark, not with the bile of a demon, but with the ink of the diary I had been writing in for days, over and over, until the pages were a solid block of black. I reached out and touched my reflection's face. The glass was cold, unresponsive, and unmoving. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a ringing in my ears that sounded like a distant, disconnected telephone. I looked at the closet door, standing wide open, revealing nothing but empty hangers and a few old boxes of things I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I stood there in the center of the room, the morning sun finally beginning to bleed through the cracks in the boarded-up window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I realized then that the hallway was silent. The house was quiet. I sat down on the edge of the twin bed, the blue comforter smelling of dust and time, and waited for the door to reappear. I'm still waiting. If you ever wake up and find an extra door in your hallway, don't open it, because perhaps I'm on the other side, and I'm getting very, very hungry.